Hello everyone and welcome to the Game Engine programming series where we write a game engine from scratch. In the last video we added most of the backend logic for configuring import settings. Today we are going to work on the user interface for geometry import settings. Let me first set the tag property of each tab item to its corresponding asset type enumeration. Actually, we don't need to do this right now, but I did it anyway. It will be used for filtering imported items in a later video. As a warming up, we can start by making the tab control automatically select the first tab that contains items. For example, it will select the texture tab if we only drop image files onto the content browser, but it will select geometry if we dropped only FBX files or a mix of FBX files and image files. This is done easily by setting the selected index of our tab control depending on which configurator contains any proxies. Here we see the texture tab being selected after I dropped images, and it will select the geometry tab when I drop FBX files. Let's work on the settings configurator user interface next. We'll start with geometry, since it's simpler than the one we'll make for texture. First, we add a new user control and call it configure geometry import settings. After updating the namespace, we can set its design time data context to geometry import settings configurator, which we wrote in the previous video. We also bind the actual data context of the grid to the same class. However, the data context for the user control itself will be still configure import settings. This way we'll have access to properties outside of the geometry import settings configurator. The grid will have 3 columns. The first column contains a list of proxies that can be imported using an import button. The second column contains all settings that can be configured for importing FBX files. And the third column will have a list of items that are being imported and their status. Starting with the first column, there is a dock panel that contains the import button and a list of proxies. I'll put this button in a horizontal stack panel in case we need to add more buttons later. The button is enabled only if we have any proxies to be imported. Then we have a list box where we bind the collection of geometry proxies to its item source. I'd like the item's background color to alternate between 2 colors, and we want to also be able to select multiple items in the list. I wanted to have an orange border brush that appears when we drag a file onto the list box. In addition, we want this list box to also accept dropped items. On listbox drop, we'll handle the drop event. We are going to write this method a bit later. Next, I'll quickly add a style for alternating the color of listbox items. This is a simple trigger for item control's alternating index property, which is either 0 or 1, since we set the alternation count of the list box to 2. If the index is 0, then the background color of that list box item will be transparent. It will use a darker gray color otherwise. I'll generate the event handlers so we can build and run the editor. I forgot to add the new user control to our configuration window. We can add it while the editor is running. Here we see the list box, but I can't see the alternating colors. And that's because I also forgot to set the item container style to use the style we just added. This is what you get when you're 103 years old. You forget to do things all the time. Now we can see that every other item's got a darker background. We do still have to define the way each item is displayed in the list. Right now it just displays the type of each item. We can define the appearance of an item in a data template and set it as the item template of the list box. We'll use a grid that will contain various pieces of information about each file. Of course, you can design this however you please. Here I set up the tooltip to display the file path. Further, I'll divide the grid in 2 columns and 3 rows. The item number is shown in the first row and column. Normally I'd use the alternation count for this in the same way as we did in Geometry Details view. However, we already used the alternation count for the background color of our items. So here I'm going to use a multi-binding with a value converter in order to get the index of the current item. In the converter, we check if the value parameter contains data that we can use. If so, we get the index of the item and add 1 so that it's not 0 based and starts at 1. Also import system collections namespace in order to use iList interface. Now we can use it in the XAML code. Let me actually rename it to indexOfConverter so it's more obvious what it does. We'll display the file name in the second column next to the item number in the first row. Last modified date of the file will be shown in the second row below the file name. And in the third row we display the file size. Here again we'll use the size converter that returns a string in magnitudes of bytes. I'd also like to be able to remove any file from the list. Therefore, we can add a button with a red cross in it. This button is only visible when we hover over the list box item with the mouse. I'll use 2 lines to create the cross. Before I forget, I also add a local style for text blocks, which is based on the global light text box style. For some reason, some controls won't pick up the global style unless I do it this way. We can base the style of the remove button on simple button style, which is defined in control templates.xaml resource dictionary. Here you can see that it's just a border with a gray background and a content presenter. And the border's background toggles to a lighter color when the mouse is hovering over the button. I'll add a few setters for various properties. I'll also add a local style for the line control, which we use to display the red cross. We can then use these styles for the remove button and the lines. And as I mentioned, we only want to show the button when the mouse is over a list box item. This trigger will take care of that. When I drop a bunch of FBX files, we can see that a red cross is displayed on the item where our mouse is, but it doesn't seem to be in the right place. I'm going to figure out why that is. In addition, we only have 2 columns, so a column index of 2 doesn't make sense here. It should be 1. As you can see, it's also only visible when the mouse is over the text in the list box item, which suggests that it's a matter of setting the alignment property to stretch to the width of the item. However, I'm not sure yet for which control I'm supposed to set this property. Setting the alignment of the button itself also didn't help. Oh, I see. We should set the horizontal content alignment of the list box so that it stretches the items to the full width of the list box. Now we can see the button being displayed on the right side. Next, I'd like the selected item to get the focus as soon as this control is loaded. We can attach an event handler to the loaded event. If we can find an item that is selected, then it will receive the focus. Removing an item is fairly easy. It's a matter of getting the data context of the listbox item as a proxy and calling remove file method of the configurator. However, this will mess up the item numbering, as you can see here. We can fix this by doing a little hack, which I'm not proud of, but this is minor enough not to spend a lot of time on figuring out how to do it properly. To do this, I'm going to add a new function that will make the list box regenerate its items. We can do this by raising a property changed event by calling on property change method of our view model. This method is protected, and the only way to call it is by making it protected internal. I don't particularly like this and might solve this issue in some other way later, but for now we can try this. So when we tell the list box that the list of proxies has been changed, we will regenerate all items including their indices. And we'll call this method whenever we remove an item. Now we can see that numbering items is correct when we remove items. Importing items is also simple. We just have to call the import method of the geometry import settings configurator. Finally, we need to add new proxies when we drop files onto the list box. Because we want to be able to import other content types, such as images as well as FBX files, I'm going to add a static method to configurator window class that can be called from any configurator. And we also need to call refresh listbox items at the end. In this method, we check if the drop event arguments contain file data, and if so, we'll first determine the destination folder to use and then pass the array of files and the destination folder to the import settings configurator. The destination folder will be that of the last item already in the list of proxies, and if the configurator doesn't have any proxies, we'll use the last destination folder property of the configurator. This happens if the user removed all items from the list, or if the configurator window was opened without dropping files onto the content browser, which is something we'll implement in the next episode. Now I can drop more files onto the list box and they'll be added as listbox items. One thing I'd like to add is to have the border of the list box change colors when we drag files over it. We can do this in XAML by adding event triggers for drag enter, drag leave, and drop events. Make sure to use the preview events in order to always get triggered. We can also display a small message in order to let the user know that they can drop files here. This is simply a text block that's only visible when the list box is empty. And I'll add a grid splitter so that we can resize the panel on the left. Here we can see that the message is displayed when I remove all items. I was expecting to see an orange border, but I am seeing a blue one instead. Although I think it also looks pretty, it's not really noticeable, so I'm going to try and get the orange border working. This is odd, because when the listbox item loses its focus, the orange border does show. Anyway, I think I have to look at the global listbox style in the control templates to see if we can fix this. Here we see that when the selection is active, the border brush of the border control is being set to selected background brush, which is blue. This overrides the colors that we set in our drag event animations. I can simply remove the target name so that it will listen to the template binding instead. Now we see that we always get the orange border. Again, feel free to choose any color that you like for this. I'm going to delete all geometry assets in order to test if the importing still works when we press the import button. I accidentally imported the lap scene, which causes a crash in FBX SDK in debug build, so I'm going to just close the editor and reopen it. Here we see that all other meshes were imported successfully. Okay, we have got a bit of time left, so I'm going to start working on the second panel, which is actually the reason we created this whole configuration system. And that's the part where we can configure the import settings for each file. We start by adding a border with a grid inside, the data context of which is bound to the selected proxy in the list box. The grid is also only visible when its data context is not null, or in other words, if there is at least one item selected. The grid has 4 rows, the first of which is just a text block that says which files import settings are currently shown. The second row will display the import settings. We are going to put the settings in their own user control, so for now I'll use a border as the placeholder. Or maybe a stack panel so we can add more text blocks. In the next row, I'll add 3 buttons that will apply these settings to the selected items to all items or save them as default settings, so they can be used when importing individual files. We'll implement the first 2 buttons. The default settings is for a later episode when we add a module for saving and loading various editor settings. When Apply to Selection button is clicked, we get the list of selected items for Geometry list box and copy the settings from the selected item to each item in the list. Note that the selected item is itself in the list, so we do 1 extra copy. I'm okay with leaving it as is, since it doesn't do a lot of damage in terms of performance and memory usage. When the Apply to All button is clicked, we directly copy the settings of the selected item to all proxies in the list. Again, this has 1 extra copy since the selected item is also in the list. That's all for this panel for now. Before wrapping it up, I'll add the third panel, which will display a list of items that are being or have been imported and whether they were imported successfully or failed. Again, for now I'm only going to add a placeholder for this, since we'll hopefully get around to implementing it in the next episode. To summarize, now we have this window that opens when we drop FBX files onto the content browser, and we are presented with a list of files that can be imported, the panel for import settings configuration in the middle, and the list of imported files in the right side. In the next episode, we are going to finish this and also implement settings configuration for textures, which is a bit more complicated since we need to be able to assemble multiple images for creating texture arrays and 3D textures. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you join me on Patreon, you'll get access to the code on GitHub, so you don't have to type everything over from the video. Plus, there are also other nice goodies and rewards exclusive to my Patreon supporters. Please use the link in the video description to check them out. I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care and happy game engineering!